the devil's accountant. He didn't do business during daylight hours. Dmitri Volkov conducted his empire from a penthouse that overlooked Moscow like a throne room. All black marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the city's lights back at itself. By day, he was a legitimate businessman. Investments, real estate, technology ventures. By night, he was what the streets whispered about in careful voices. The man who controlled everything the law pretended didn't exist. And he'd built that empire on one simple principle. Everyone had a price. Everyone except, apparently, his new accountant. Dmitri stood at his window at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, a glass of vodka in his hand that he wouldn't drink, watching the woman who'd somehow become both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. Irina Morozova sat at the conference table in his office, surrounded by ledgers and laptops, her dark hair falling forward as she worked with a kind of focused intensity that made Dmitri's chest tighten in ways that had nothing to do with business. She'd been working for him for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of transforming his chaotic financial empire into something the authorities couldn't touch, of finding loopholes and solutions that kept his operations running smoothly while staying just inside the margins of legal. She was brilliant, ruthlessly efficient, and completely immune to every method of manipulation Dmitri had perfected over 20 years of controlling people. He'd tried charm. She'd looked at him like he was wasting her time. He'd tried intimidation. She'd raised one elegant eyebrow and asked if he wanted his accounts reconciled or if he preferred to continue posturing. He tried money, offered her triple what he was paying. She declined and told him the current rate was sufficient. Irina Morozova didn't want his charm, didn't fear his reputation, and didn't care about his money beyond the professional compensation she'd negotiated. And that made her the most dangerous woman Dmitri had ever met. "You're staring," Irina said, without looking up from her laptop. Her voice was cool, professional, completely unaffected by his presence. "It's distracting. It's my office, and these are your accounts, which won't balance themselves while you hover like a surveillance drone." Dmitri felt his mouth curve into something that wasn't quite a smile. Most people, men and women both, were either terrified of him or trying desperately to impress him. Irina Morozova did neither. She treated him like an inconvenient but necessary employer. Like his reputation for violence and his connections to Moscow's underworld were irrelevant details that didn't impact her work. It should have irritated him. Instead, it made him want her with an intensity that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. "The Chechen accounts," Dmitri said, moving away from the window. "You said there was a problem." "Not a problem. An irregularity." Irina finally looked up, and Dmitri felt the impact of her gray eyes like a physical thing. She was beautiful in an austere way. Sharp cheekbones, full mouth, pale skin that suggested she spent too much time indoors with numbers instead of people. Someone skimming. Small amounts, carefully distributed across multiple transactions. But it's there. How much? Over the past 6 months? Approximately 2 million rubles. Dmitri felt his jaw tighten. 2 million wasn't significant to his overall operation. But the principle mattered. Someone had stolen from him. Someone thought they could get away with it. "Find them," he said quietly. "Already did." Irina turned her laptop toward him, showing a spreadsheet with highlighted transactions. "Your logistics coordinator, Petrov. He's been very clever about it, but not clever enough." She'd been with him 6 weeks, and she'd already identified a theft that Dmitri's previous accountants, 3 of them over 2 years, had missed completely. "What do you suggest?" he asked, curious what she'd recommend. Irina closed her laptop. "Fire him. Recover what you can. Move on. Making an example of him draws attention you don't need, and the amount isn't worth the exposure." Practical, efficient, and completely contrary to how Dmitri normally handled betrayal. "You know what I do to people who steal from me," he said. "I know what you're rumored to do. I also know that actually doing it would be idiotic given your current negotiations with the Georgians. Petrov has cousins in Tbilisi. You kill him. You complicate those negotiations. You fire him quietly. You lose 2 million rubles, but maintain strategic relationships worth significantly more." She was right. Tactically, strategically, she was absolutely right. But Dmitri hadn't built his reputation on forgiveness. "You're very certain of yourself, Miss Morozova." I'm certain of the numbers, Mr. Volkov. What you do with that certainty is your business. She stood, gathering her things. It's late. I'm going home, unless you need something else. The question was professional neutral. But Dmitri caught the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped her bag a fraction too tightly. Irina Morozova wasn't as unaffected as she pretended. Stay, he said. It wasn't a request. It was the tone Dmitri used when he expected obedience, when he was used to people rearranging their lives to accommodate his preferences. Irina tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression that might have been amusement. Why? Because I'm not finished discussing the accounts. Yes, you are. You're just not finished with whatever else you want to discuss that has nothing to do with numbers. Direct, unflinching, calling him out with the same casual efficiency she applied to his financial records. Dmitri felt something dark and hungry unfurl in his chest. And if I said what I wanted to discuss was you, he asked, moving closer. Irina didn't retreat, just watched him approach with those steady gray eyes, waiting. Then I'd say that's inappropriate for an employer-employee relationship, and we should maintain professional boundaries. Should we? Yes. But she still didn't move, didn't leave, just stood there, close enough now that Dmitri could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that probably cost more than she'd admit. You're not afraid of me, Dmitri observed. Should I be? Most people are. I'm not most people. Irina's voice was steady, but Dmitri noticed the slight acceleration in her breathing, the way her pupils dilated as he stepped even closer. And fear is unproductive. It clouds judgment, makes people make mistakes. So you decided not to fear me as a professional choice? I've decided not to fear you because fear gives you power. And you have enough power already, Mr. Volkov. I don't need to add to it. God, she was magnificent, standing here in his office at midnight, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to play the games everyone else played, just existing in her own certainty like it was armor. Dmitri wanted to strip that armor away piece by piece until he found the woman underneath. What if I wanted to add to my power, he asked softly, close enough now that he could see the gold flecks in her gray eyes. Then I'd tell you to find it somewhere else. I'm your accountant, not your conquest. And if I fired you? Something flickered in Irina's expression. Not fear, but assessment. Then you'd be an idiot. I'm the best financial strategist you've ever employed. You'd be sacrificing significant operational advantage for momentary satisfaction. You assume the satisfaction would be momentary. I assume nothing. I calculate probabilities. But her voice had gone slightly rougher, and Dmitri saw her swallow. And the probability that mixing professional and personal interests ends well is approximately 7%. I like those odds. You would. You're a man who spent his entire life defying probability. Dmitri reached up slowly, giving her time to retreat, and traced one finger along her jaw. Irina's breath caught, barely audible, but he heard it. You're not as unaffected as you pretend, he murmured. I never said I was unaffected. Irina's eyes met his, and Dmitri saw heat there underneath the professional composure. I said maintaining professional boundaries was appropriate. Those are different things. So you want me? That's irrelevant. Is it? Irina stepped back, finally breaking the proximity that had been building between them. But her breathing was faster now. Her composure cracked just enough for Dmitri to see the one underneath. Yes, she said firmly, because acting on want without considering consequences is how empires fall. You taught me that yourself. I taught you that? Your entire operation is built on exploiting other people's inability to control their wants. Gambling, drugs, sex, protection. You've made billions because people can't resist their impulses. She picked up her bag. I won't be another person who destroys themselves by wanting what they shouldn't have. She walked toward the door, and Dmitri let her go, because she was right. Chasing her would prove her point about impulse control. But at the door, Irina paused. For what it's worth, she said quietly, not turning around. If circumstances were different, if I wasn't your employee, if you weren't my only source of income. She paused. The probability would be higher. Then she left, and Dmitri stood alone in his office, his body tight with unspent desire, his mind replaying the moment when Irina's breath had caught, when her pupils had dilated, when she'd admitted carefully, strategically, that the wanting wasn't one-sided. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Petrov," he said when the man answered, "you're fired. You have 24 hours to return the money you stole. Do that and we're finished. Fail, and I'll reconsider Miss Morozova's advice about strategic restraint." He ended the call and poured himself another vodka. Irina Morozova had been right about the Chechen situation, right about Petrov, right about the dangerous stupidity of mixing business with desire. But she'd also been wrong about one thing. Dmitri Volkov had spent 20 years building an empire by understanding that everyone had a price. Irina's price wasn't money or fear or charm. It was circumstances. And circumstances, unlike probability, could be changed. For 3 days, Dmitri did nothing. He attended meetings, managed operations, watched his empire function with a smooth efficiency that Irina's financial restructuring had enabled. He saw her during business hours, brief encounters in his office where she'd update him on accounts or flag potential issues. Professional, distant, like their midnight conversation had never happened. But Dmitri noticed things. The way Irina's hand trembled slightly when passing him documents. The careful distance she maintained, never getting close enough to touch. The way her eyes would flicker to his mouth for a split second before she'd catch herself and redirect her attention. She wanted him. She was just disciplined enough to resist. On the 4th day, Dmitri made his move. "Miss Morozova," he said as she was preparing to leave his office after their daily briefing, "I have a proposition." Irina paused, her bag already over her shoulder. "I'm listening." "I'm terminating your employment." He watched the shock cross her face, quickly controlled, but visible. "I see. May I ask why?" "Because you were correct. Mixing professional and personal interests is inadvisable. So I'm removing the professional component." Irina's expression shifted from shock to understanding to something that might have been anger. "You're firing me so you can pursue me without ethical complications?" "I'm firing you and offering you a different position." "I don't want a different position." "You haven't heard what it is yet." "I don't need to." "Whatever it is, the answer is no." Dmitri stood, moving around his desk. Irina didn't retreat, but he saw her tense. "I'm offering you partnership," he said, "not employment. True partnership. 40% stake in the legitimate holdings. Input on all major decisions. Legal protection and compensation that would make you independently wealthy within a year." He watched Irina process this, saw the calculations happening behind her eyes. "In exchange for what?" she asked carefully. "Your brilliance, your strategic mind, your ability to see patterns no one else sees." He paused. "And the freedom to explore what we both know exists between us without the complication of employer-employee dynamics. That's manipulation. That's removing obstacles by creating new ones. If I accept partnership and we become involved, I'm still dependent on you financially. The power dynamic doesn't change. Except you'd own 40%. You could walk away at any time with significant assets. You'd have legal protections, independent income streams, leverage." Dmitri stepped closer. "I'm not trying to trap you, Irina. I'm trying to make you an equal." She laughed, short, bitter. "There's no such thing as equals in your world, Dmitri. There's only different levels of control." It was the first time she'd used his first name. The sound of it in her mouth made something primal tighten in his gut. "Then let me control this," he said softly. "Let me remove every reason you have to say no until the only thing left is whether you want me as much as I want you. And if I still say no, then you say no, and I'll find another accountant, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened." Irina was quiet for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his face for deception, for the angle, for whatever trap she was certain existed. "Why?" she finally asked. "You could have any woman in Moscow. Probably have had most of them. Why am I worth this kind of restructuring?" "Because you're the first person in 20 years who's looked at me and seen a man instead of a monster. Because you challenge me instead of fearing me. Because when you calculate probabilities, you don't factor my reputation. You just see the numbers. Because you're brilliant," Dmitri said instead. "And I've spent 20 years surrounded by people who either fear me or want to use me. You do neither. You just exist in your own certainty. And that's, he searched for the word. That's intoxicating. Irina's expression softened slightly. That's the most honest thing you've said to me. I'm capable of honesty. I just rarely find it strategically useful. And now I think honesty is the only strategy that might work with you. She studied him for another long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, she set down her bag. I want everything in writing, she said. Partnership agreement drafted by independent counsel. Legal protections. Clear delineation of assets and responsibilities. And a clause that allows me to exit without penalty if it doesn't work. Triumph surged through Dmitri, but he kept his expression neutral. Agreed. And I want time to review the documents, to think about whether this is actually what I want or just what you've convinced me I want. How much time? A week. 3 days. Irina's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. This isn't a negotiation, Dmitri. Everything is a negotiation. Fine. 5 days. And during those 5 days, you don't contact me. You don't send gifts or make gestures or try to influence my decision. You just wait. It was torture. The idea of giving Irina 5 days of space when he wanted her in his bed immediately. But Dmitri had learned patience in a harder school than most people could imagine. 5 days, he agreed. Irina picked up her bag again. But instead of leaving immediately, she stepped close. Close enough that Dmitri could feel the heat of her, could see the rapid pulse at her throat. For the record, she said softly, the probability was never 7%. It was closer to 93. I just didn't want to admit that wanting you was destroying my professional judgment. She left before Dmitri could respond, and he stood alone in his office with his body tight and his mind already counting down the hours until he could have her. Not as an employee, not as someone he controlled, but as an equal who'd chosen him despite, or perhaps because of knowing exactly what he was. To be continued. The 5 days were the longest of Dmitri's life. He handled business, managed operations, made the kinds of decisions that kept his empire functioning. But every hour felt elongated, every interaction hollow, every moment calibrated against the countdown in his head. For days, 3 days, 2. On the evening of the 5th day at precisely 8 p.m., Irina Morozova walked into his penthouse. She'd used the private elevator, the one whose access code only 3 people possessed. She wore a black dress that was simultaneously professional and devastating. Her dark hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in her usual severe style. And she carried a folder. I had 3 different law firms review the partnership agreement, she said, without preamble, setting the folder on his dining table. They all confirmed it's legitimate, that I'd have real power, real protection, real assets. Dmitri leaned against the window, forcing himself to remain still despite every instinct screaming at him to close the distance between them. And, he asked, and I have questions. Ask them. Irina moved through his penthouse slowly, taking in the space with the same analytical attention she applied to his finances. This isn't about the business. It's personal. All right. Why me? She turned to face him. And don't give me the answer about brilliance or challenge. I want the real reason, the one you haven't said. Dmitri was quiet for a long moment. Honesty, he told her, the only strategy that might work. Because when you look at me, you see exactly what I am. Someone who's built power through violence and manipulation and careful control. And you don't flinch. You don't judge. You just calculate whether I'm worth the risk. He paused. And for the first time in 20 years, I want to be worth it. The admission hung in the air between them, more vulnerable than Dmitri had allowed himself to be since he was a very different man in a very different life. Irina set down her bag, slowly. I've been with 3 men in my life. All of them were safe, appropriate, the kind of men my family approved of, and all 3 relationships ended because I was bored. She moved closer. I've never been bored around you. Uncomfortable sometimes. Challenged constantly. Aware that you're dangerous in ways I don't fully understand. But never bored. Closer still. So, I signed the partnership agreement. It's in the folder. And I came here tonight to tell you that I accept. She was close enough now that Dmitri could see the pulse hammering in her throat, could smell her perfume, could feel the heat radiating from her skin. "And then," he asked, his voice rougher than intended, "and then I'm going to kiss you. And we're going to find out if 93% probability translates to actual chemistry. And if it does..." She looked up at him through dark lashes. "If it does, Dmitri Volkov, you're going to show me exactly what you've been thinking about for the past 6 weeks." Dmitri felt something break loose in his chest. Restraint, maybe, or the careful control he'd maintained for 5 agonizing days. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said softly, reaching up to cup her face. "Tell me." "I've been thinking about how you'd taste. Whether you'd be as controlled in bed as you are with my counts. Whether that professional composure would shatter if I touched you the right way." Irina's breathing had quickened. And I've been thinking about taking you apart slowly, learning every place that makes you gasp, finding out what it takes to make you lose that beautiful discipline you wear like armor. That's quite a list. I have detailed plans. I'm very thorough." So, it was permission and challenge, an invitation all at once. Dmitri didn't need to be told twice. He kissed her, not gently, not with the careful restraint he'd been maintaining, but with all the hunger that had been building for 6 weeks, with a desire that had made the past 5 days feel like torture, with the need to finally have this woman who'd walked into his world and refused to play by anyone's rules but her own. Irina kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt, her mouth opening under his, a small sound of want escaping her throat that went straight to Dmitri's groin. She tasted like expensive wine and something darker. Ambition, maybe, or the same hunger that had been eating at him since she'd first looked at him like he was a problem to be solved instead of a monster to be feared. Dmitri backed her against the window, his hands sliding into her hair, angling her head for deeper access. Irina's fingers found his belt, pulling him closer, and the feel of her body against his, soft curves against hard muscle, made Dmitri's control slip another notch. "Bedroom." Irina breathed against his mouth. "Here first." He spun her to face the glass, pressing against her back, his mouth finding the sensitive spot below her ear. Irina's breath hitched, and Dmitri felt her arch back into him. "Anyone could see," she said, but there was no real protest in her voice. "Let them." His hand slid down her sides, feeling the curve of her waist, the flare of her hips. "Let them see that you chose this, that you chose me. Possessive. You have no idea." Dmitri's hands found the hem of her dress, sliding underneath, tracing the smooth skin of her thighs. Irina's head fell back against his shoulder, her breathing uneven now, her control starting to fracture. "Dmitri," she said, and there was need in her voice that made his own desire spike higher. "Tell me what you want," he murmured against her neck. "You. I want you. Be specific." Her laugh was shaky. "For someone who claims to know what he wants, you're asking a lot of questions. I want to hear you say it. I want to hear that controlled voice break when you admit what you need." Irina turned in his arms, her gray eyes dark with desire. "I need you to stop talking and start delivering on those detailed plans you mentioned." Challenge accepted. Dmitri lifted her, Irina's legs wrapping around his waist automatically, and carried her to the bedroom. He set her down beside the bed, his hands finding the zipper of her dress. "Wait," Irina said, catching his wrist. Dmitri froze immediately. "Too fast?" "No, just..." She looked up at him, vulnerable in a way she'd never been in his office. "I need to know this isn't just conquest for you, that I'm not just another thing you've acquired." The question was fair. Dmitri had acquired a lot of things, businesses, properties, people. But Irina Morozova wasn't something to be possessed. "If this was about conquest," he said carefully, "I would have pushed the first night, would have used every weapon I have to break down your resistance until you gave in." He cupped her face. "This is about wanting you as an equal, as a partner, as someone who challenges me to be better than the monster everyone thinks I am." Irina studied his face, searching for deception. Then, apparently satisfied, she reached up and pulled him down for another kiss. Slower this time, deeper, with a tenderness that made Dmitri's chest ache in unfamiliar ways. When they broke apart, Irina stepped back and slowly unzipped her dress, letting it fall to the floor. and Dmitri forgot how to breathe. She was perfect. Pale skin, elegant curves, black lace lingerie that probably cost a fortune and looked like it had been designed specifically to destroy his sanity. But it was the confidence in the way she stood there, letting him look, that made Dmitri's desire shift from hunger to something more consuming. "Your turn," Irina said, her voice steady despite the color high on her cheeks. Dmitri removed his shirt, his belt, his pants, watching Irina's eyes track every movement. When he stepped close to her again, both of them in their underwear, the feeling of skin against skin made them both inhale sharply. "Detailed plans," Irina reminded him, her voice slightly breathless. "Right." Dmitri guided her to the bed, laying her down with more care than he'd shown anything in years. "Step 1. Find out what makes you gasp." His mouth found her throat, her collarbone, the curve of her breast above the lace. Irina's hands tangled in his hair, her breathing growing ragged as he explored. When his teeth grazed her nipple through the lace, Irina gasped. "Found one," Dmitri murmured. "That's not fair." Her words cut off as he did it again, his tongue soothing the small hurt. "I'm what? Too good at this." Pride surged through him. "We're just getting started." He unhooked her bra, tossing it aside, and took his time learning the weight of her breasts, the taste of her skin, the sound she made when he sucked and bit and teased. Irina was responsive, beautifully, desperately responsive, her hips lifting off the bed, her fingers digging into his shoulders, small sounds escaping her throat that made Dmitri want to hear more. "Step 2, he said, kissing his way down her stomach. "Find out if you're as disciplined everywhere as you are in my office." "Dmitri, tell me to stop if you want to stop." But Irina didn't tell him to stop. She just watched him with dark eyes as he hooked his fingers into her underwear and slowly pulled it down. Then she was naked beneath him, vulnerable and stunning. And Dmitri took a moment just to look, to appreciate the gift she was giving him by choosing him, despite every logical reason not to. He settled between her thighs, and at the first touch of his tongue, Irina's back arched off the bed. "Oh God," she breathed. Dmitri smiled against her skin and set about systematically destroying her control. He learned what made her moan, slow, broad strokes. What made her gasp, focused attention on her clit. What made her beg, the combination of his tongue and his fingers, working in rhythm until Irina was writhing beneath him, her hands fisted in his hair, her professional composure completely shattered. "Dmitri, please." "Please what?" "Don't stop. Don't you dare stop." He had no intention of stopping. Not until he'd given her everything she needed. Not until he'd proven that them together, was worth every risk she'd calculated. When Irina came, it was with his name on her lips and her whole body trembling. And Dmitri had never seen anything more beautiful than her in that moment. Uncontrolled, unguarded, completely his. He kissed his way back up her body, giving her time to recover, feeling satisfied and desperately hard at the same time. Irina pulled him down for a kiss, tasting herself on his mouth, and Dmitri felt his control slip even further. "Your plans are very thorough," she said, her voice still shaky. "We're only on step 2. How many steps are there?" "As many as it takes." Irina's hand slid down between them, wrapping around him through his boxers. Dmitri inhaled sharply at the contact. "I have some plans of my own," she said, and there was challenge in her eyes that made his desire spike even higher. She pushed him onto his back, straddling him, her hands exploring his chest, his stomach, the hard lines of muscle she'd only seen through shirts before. Dmitri let her explore, watching her face as she learned his body, seeing the desire and curiosity and determination in her expression. When she finally removed his boxers and took him in hand properly, skin to skin, Dmitri's head fell back with a groan. "Irina, tell me what you want," she said, echoing his earlier words. "Be specific. I want to be inside you. Want to feel you around me. Want." His words cut off as she stroked him slowly, deliberately. "Keep going. Want to make you come again while I'm buried so deep you forget your own name. Want to hear you scream. Want to mark you so thoroughly that every time you calculate probabilities tomorrow, you'll remember tonight." Irina's eyes darkened. "Yes," she said simply. She positioned herself over him, and Dmitri grabbed her hips, helping guide her down. The feeling of entering her, tight and wet and perfect, made them both gasp. God, Irina breathed, her hands braced on his chest. Dmitri couldn't speak, could barely think, could only feel the exquisite sensation of being inside her, of watching her take him inch by inch until she was fully seated. Her eyes closed, her mouth slightly open. Move, he managed. Please, Irina, move. She did slowly at first, finding her rhythm, and Dmitri watched her with something approaching reverence. This woman who'd walked into his world and refused to be controlled, who'd challenged him at every turn, who was now riding him with increasing confidence, her head thrown back, her breasts bouncing with each movement. He was never letting her go. The thought should have terrified him. Dmitri Volkov didn't do attachment, didn't do vulnerability, didn't let people become indispensable. But Irina had already become all of those things. He flipped them without warning, putting her beneath him, and Irina gasped at the sudden change. Too much control, Dmitri explained, punctuating his words with a deep thrust that made Irina's eyes widen. Need to feel you let go completely. He set a rhythm that was harder, faster, deeper than Irina's measured pace. Her nails raked down his back, and the sharp pleasure pain made Dmitri groan. Yes, Irina said, her legs wrapping around his waist. Like that. Exactly like that. Dmitri could feel her tightening around him, could feel his own orgasm building at the base of his spine. He reached between them, finding her clit, rubbing in circles that matched his thrusts. Come for me, he demanded. Want to feel it? Want to feel you fall apart? Dmitri. Now, Irina, come now. And she did, her whole body going rigid, her inner muscles clenching around him, his name leaving her lips like a prayer or a curse. The sensation pushed Dmitri over the edge, and he came with a force that felt like it rearranged something fundamental in his chest. They collapsed together, breathing hard, bodies tangled, the sweat and heat and aftermath of something that had been building for 6 weeks. After a long moment, Irina spoke. That was better than 7% probability? Dmitri asked, finding the energy to smile. She laughed, genuine, unguarded. Significantly better. I may need to recalculate my entire risk assessment model. Or, Dmitri said, pulling her closer, you could accept that some things aren't about probability. They're about certainty. Irina propped herself up on his chest, looking down at him with those gray eyes that saw too much. And you're certain about this? About us? I'm certain that you're the first person in 20 years I've wanted to wake up next to. That's enough for now. She kissed him, soft and lingering, then settled against his side with a satisfied sound that made Dmitri's chest feel strange and warm. They lay in silence for a while, and Dmitri found himself thinking about partnership agreements and strategic restructuring, and the irony that the one thing he'd wanted to control had required him to give up control entirely. Dmitri. Irina's voice was sleepy. Yes, thank you for the 5 days, for letting me choose this instead of manipulating me into it. He kissed the top of her head. Thank you for choosing it. I haven't decided if I've made a brilliant strategic move or the worst mistake of my life. We'll find out together. And for the first time since he'd built his empire on fear and control, Dmitri Volkov found himself hoping that tomorrow would come slower. Because tonight, with Irina Morozova in his arms, he'd found something more valuable than power. He'd found someone who saw exactly what he was and wanted him anyway. And that was worth more than all the calculated probabilities in the world.